Nathaniel Owens pulled his sleek obsidian-colored sedan into the cobblestone driveway of his estate on the outskirts of Seattle at exactly 4:47 on a misty Thursday afternoon. This was nearly 2 hours earlier than his usual arrival, a rarity for a man whose life was measured in quarterly earnings and board meetings. He had left the skyscraper downtown without a word to his assistant, loosening his silk tie as he drove across the Evergreen Point floating bridge. His mind a chaotic swarm of unfinished contracts and looming deadlines. His only goal for the day was to sink into the plush leather of his sofa, shut his eyes against the gray Washington sky, and exist in a vacuum of silence until the sun rose the following morning. The house, a sprawling masterpiece of glass and steel overlooking Lake Washington, usually felt more like a gallery than a home cold echoes of a life that once was, and filled with a silence that felt heavy enough to drown in. But the moment he pushed open the heavy oak front door, his plan for a silent retreat vanished like smoke in the wind. Music was drifting through the foyer, leaking out from the grand living room. It wasn't the sterile digital sound of a television or a high-end speaker system. It was raw, vibrant, and alive. He heard the steady, earthy thrum of a woman's voice, firm, unhurried, and possessed of a warmth he hadn't encountered in years. Beneath that voice was the unmistakable rhythmic jangle of a small guitar being strummed with deliberate care, and accompanying it was the heartbeat-like pulse of bongo drums. The rhythm was slightly off, a bit hesitant, but it carried a sense of purpose that made the air in the house feel thick with electricity. Nathaniel set his leather briefcase on the marble floor, with excruciating care making no sound, and moved toward the living room with the stealth of a man afraid of shattering a fragile glass sculpture. He stopped at the edge of the doorway, leaning his shoulder against the cold drywall, and what he saw caused his breath to hitch in his throat. Rose, the woman he had hired 3 months ago to handle the cleaning and prepare simple meals for the household, was kneeling on the Persian rug in the center of the room. She was leaning slightly toward a small makeshift microphone stand, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the afternoon light, filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. To her left sat Ethan, his 6-year-old son, cross-legged on the carpet. He held a small red guitar in his lap, his tiny fingers pressing down on the strings with a level of concentration that seemed far too intense for a child of his age. To her right was Liam, Ethan's twin, his palms flat against a pair of wooden bongos, his eyes locked onto Rose's face, as if she were the only fixed point in a spinning world. Nathaniel didn't move. He didn't even dare to blink. He just stood there, a silent observer in his own home, watching a scene that felt like a miracle, unfolding in slow motion. For 2 long years he had watched his sons slowly retreat into themselves, becoming like 2 small doors, closing an inch at a time, until the light behind them was almost gone. They had lost their mother Claire, in an accident that no amount of wealth or planning could have prevented, and the grief had turned them into ghosts. He had spent thousands upon thousands of dollars on the best child psychologists in the Pacific Northwest, specialists who spoke in hushed tones about emotional processing and developmental milestones. He had moved them to a prestigious private academy and tried every routine suggested to him, but nothing had worked. And yet, here was Rose, a woman he had barely spoken to, doing more in 3 months than all the experts had done in 2 years. The sight of Ethan's fingers on those strings sent a sharp, pointed ache through Nathaniel's chest. The last time he had seen that particular spark of engagement in his son's eyes was before the world had turned gray. He remembered the warnings from their therapist, Dr. Foster, who had sat him down 6 months ago in a room that smelled of lavender and sterile professionalism. The doctor had told him plainly that the boys were showing signs of profound emotional withdrawal, that they weren't just sad, they were becoming disconnected from the world. Foster had emphasized that they needed more than just a schedule. They needed a presence, a soul to anchor them. Nathaniel had promised to be that anchor, and he had meant it with every fiber of his being. But then Monday would come with an investor call, Tuesday with a merger, and Wednesday with a crisis that only his signature could resolve. The 50 or 60-hour work weeks had become a fortress he hid inside, convinced that if he just built the estate a little higher and the bank account a little larger, he could protect them from the pain. He had convinced himself that providing was the same thing as parenting. But as he watched Rose adjust the microphone, he realized he had been building a monument to his own guilt, while his sons were starving for something money couldn't buy. The meeting he had just come from had lasted 4 hours and had secured a partnership that would expand his firm into 3 new territories. He had walked out of that boardroom feeling like a conqueror, but standing in his hallway, he felt like a pauper. He owed these 2 boys a debt that no spreadsheet could calculate, a debt of time and attention that he had been paying to strangers instead of the people who shared his last name. Rose lowered her voice, slowing the tempo of the song and creating a wide open space in the melody. It was a deliberate pause, an invitation for the boys to step into the gap. Ethan filled the silence with a shaky but resonant chord, and Liam followed with a sharp, clear strike on the bongos. Rose didn't take back the lead. She wrapped her voice around their sounds, supporting them, letting them be the architects of the moment. Nathaniel's throat tightened as he recognized the profound grace in her actions. She wasn't performing for them. She was letting them lead, giving them the agency they had lost when their world was turned upside down. She was teaching them that they still had a voice, that they could still create something beautiful even when things felt broken. Close your eyes and just feel it. Rose whispered, her gaze drifting to Liam. The boy's shoulders were hunched up toward his ears, a physical manifestation of the tension he carried every day. It doesn't have to be perfect, Liam. It just has to be yours. Do you understand the difference? Nathaniel watched as his son's shoulders slowly dropped. The rhythm of the bongos shifted, becoming lighter, more fluid, and infinitely more confident. It was as if a physical weight had been lifted from the child's spirit. Rose smiled, not a rehearsed professional smile, but a quiet, genuine expression of joy that happens when you witness someone finally find a key to a locked room. In that moment, Nathaniel realized that Rose wasn't just a housekeeper. She was a curator of the souls he had nearly forgotten how to nurture. The silence that followed the end of the song was not the heavy, oppressive kind Nathaniel was used to. It was a peaceful, satisfied quiet. Ethan happened to glance toward the hallway and caught sight of his father standing there in his expensive suit, still holding his coat. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Nathaniel expected the boy to jump up to run to him, or perhaps to look guilty for making noise. But Ethan simply offered a small, fleeting smile and turned back to his guitar, his thumb tracing the wood of the fretboard. That lack of urgency hit Nathaniel harder than a scream would have. It was a silent admission that his presence was no longer the sun around which their world revolved. They had found another source of light, and they were content within it. Liam didn't notice his father for a long time. He was still lost in the afterglow of the rhythm he had created, his eyes half closed, his small body swaying slightly. There was a newfound confidence in his posture, a sturdiness that hadn't been there when Nathaniel left for work that morning at 7 o'clock. Nathaniel watched his son with a mixture of immense pride and a very specific sharp-edged pain, the kind of grief that comes when you realize you've missed a milestone you can never get back. His children were growing, evolving, and healing in ways he hadn't been there to witness. He leaned his briefcase against the wall, realizing that entering the room right now would be an intrusion. He was a stranger to this beautiful, fragile ecosystem they had built in his absence. Rose made a small adjustment to the music stand and looked at Ethan. "You missed the chord on the fourth beat, honey," she said, her voice gentle but firm. Ethan knit his brow, his small face scrunched in thought. "I thought I got it right," he murmured. "Close," Rose replied, "but close isn't the same as hitting it. Do you want to try again, or should we move on?" Ethan didn't hesitate. He repositioned his fingers with a fierce determination that Nathaniel recognized instantly. It was the same stubborn streak Nathaniel used to close deals, the refusal to accept anything less than the best. Seeing that trait mirrored in his son, harnessed for something as pure as music, brought a genuine smile to Nathaniel's face for the first time in weeks. Ethan played the segment again, and this time the chord rang out true and clear. Liam gave a sharp tap on the bongo in approval, and Rose nodded. "That's your chord, Ethan. You own it now." The boy let out a quick, muffled laugh, trying to play it cool, but failing to hide the sparkle of triumph in his eyes. They continued playing for another 15 minutes, and Nathaniel stayed exactly where he was hidden in the shadows of the hallway. He watched as Rose managed the energy of the room with an effortless grace, never pushing too hard, never letting them give up. She was building their resilience brick by brick through the medium of melody and rhythm. When the session finally wound down, the music fading into the sounds of the Seattle evening, the distant hum of traffic, and the soft patter of rain against the glass, Rose sat back and looked at the twins. "You two were incredible today," she said. "Truly incredible." Liam threw his arms into the air and let out a triumphant shout that echoed through the high ceilings of the house. Ethan remained quiet, but the way he held his guitar told Nathaniel everything he needed to know. The instrument wasn't just a toy, it was a shield. Rose laughed, then a real, unburdened sound that seemed to fill the cracks in the house. It was that laugh that gave Nathaniel the courage to finally step into the light of the living room. As his leather shoes clicked against the hardwood floor, Rose looked up, her expression shifting instantly from joy to a professional guarded mask. She stood up quickly, smoothing her apron. "Good afternoon, Mr. Owens. I didn't realize you would be home so early. I hope the noise wasn't a disturbance." Nathaniel raised his hand, his gesture soft and placating. "Not at all, Rose. I've been standing in the hall for quite some time. I heard everything." Before she could respond, Ethan was on his feet, holding his guitar up like a trophy. "Dad, did you see? Did you hear me play?" Nathaniel knelt down so he was at his son's eye level, looking into a face that finally looked like a child's again. "I did, Ethan. It was beautiful. Where on earth did you learn to play like that?" Ethan pointed a small finger at Rose without a second of hesitation. "Rose teaches us every day when you aren't here," he said with the brutal, unvarnished honesty of a 6-year-old. Those words, "when you aren't here," struck Nathaniel with the force of a physical blow. There was no malice in the boy's voice, just a simple statement of fact, which made it all the more devastating. Nathaniel stood up and walked over to Liam, who was watching him with a more cautious expression. Liam was the observer, the one who measured the air before he chose to breathe it. Nathaniel knelt beside the bongos and ran his hand over the taut skin of the drum. "Teach me how you do that, Liam," he said softly. Liam looked at his father for a long moment, his eyes searching Nathaniel's face for something specific. "You never wanted to learn before," the boy said quietly. Nathaniel didn't flinch, didn't offer a hollow excuse about being busy or tired. He simply stayed exactly where he was, grounded and present. "I know I didn't," Nathaniel admitted, but I want to learn now, if you're willing to show me." Liam studied him for a few more heartbeats, the silence stretching between them like a bridge under construction. Finally, the boy took Nathaniel's hand, placed it flat on the center of the drum, and said, "Open palm, Dad. If you close your fingers, the sound gets choked. You have to let it breathe." Nathaniel followed the instructions, striking the drum. The sound was dull and flat. Liam wrinkled his nose. "Not like that. Watch." But deeds. For the next hour, the billionaire CEO of one of the most successful investment firms in the country sat on the floor of his living room, being schooled by a 6-year-old. Rose remained on the other side of the room, her hands folded over her apron, watching the scene with a quiet, observant intensity. Nathaniel could feel her eyes on him, but he didn't look up. He was focused entirely on his son's small hands and the lessons in rhythm. He realized that this was the most productive hour he had spent in years. There were no stakes here other than the connection between a father and his sons, yet it felt more important than any multi-million-dollar merger he had ever overseen. He was learning how to listen again, not for information, but for emotion. Ethan eventually joined in, strumming a simple progression that Rose had taught him while Liam and Nathaniel tried to keep the beat. The room was filled with a chaotic, beautiful noise that would have been unthinkable just a few months prior. Rose stepped in occasionally to correct a posture or a rhythm, her voice always maintaining that same calm, steady tone. She had a way of providing space for them to fail, without making them feel like failures. Nathaniel watched her closely, realizing that she possessed a type of emotional intelligence that he had never bothered to cultivate. She saw the boys not as problems to be solved, but as people to be known. It was a distinction that changed everything. As the evening deepened and the shadows grew long across the floorboards, the boys finally began to tire. Liam eventually leaned his head against Rose's shoulder, his eyes fluttering shut, while Ethan curled up on the other side of her, his guitar still clutched in his arms. The instruments lay scattered on the rug like discarded toys, but they felt more like sacred objects to Nathaniel now. He stood by the window looking out at the dark waters of the lake, trying to process the sheer scale of what he had witnessed. He turned to see Rose sitting on the floor, with his sons draped over her, an image of peace and maternal comfort that he had thought was gone from this house forever. "Let me take them," Nathaniel whispered, stepping forward. "You should go rest." Rose managed to stand up without waking either of the boys, her movements fluid and practiced. She straightened her apron and began to gather her things. Nathaniel stopped her before she reached the door. "Rose," he said, his voice low and thick with emotion. She paused and turned back to him. "How long has this been going on? How long have they been like this?" Rose took a breath, choosing her words with the same care she used when teaching a melody.